prevalent today as to some of the things that are occurring in this world and in the church. And when that book came out, I remember buying it by the case and giving it away because I was so impressed with the material in it, so thinking of it as being so needed in the church during that day. And then it's still a good one. If you don't have it, you ought to buy it and read it. There's still the things that there's nothing new under the sun. The material is still good material that's needed. Brother Dave is going to preach a lesson tonight on socialism, and I'm looking forward to the information he's going to share. So, Brother Dave, come preach.
So, grandchildren are what God gives you for not killing your own children. I'm sure you've heard that. The grandparents are laughing. Do you know, for the first 180 years of American civilization, the bulk of our country believed in the one true God, the God of the Bible. They believed in the one true religion, even though they had a lot of variety on that, mostly Protestantism. They believed that no nation can function and survive if the bulk of its population does not maintain those two basic tenets. I don't have time to prove that to you, but I guarantee you the bulk of the founders believe that. And so for the last 50 years, that basic foundational undergirding of our culture and our civilization has been seriously eroded, undermined, and now it is under outright heavy attack. There are things being said, taught, practiced in our day that you don't even have to go back beyond my parents were alive today, they would not believe it. We're in serious trouble. And I recognize that our country is not a Christian country in the biblical sense. I recognize that. But let's not miss the point here. Our nation's never been a Buddhist nation. We've never been a Hindu nation. We've never been a Muslim nation. And nor have we been an atheistic, unbelieving, skeptical nation. The bulk of our citizens have acknowledged that there is a God and He's the God of the Bible. Well, now even the very basic foundational structure of our country is being challenged to the point that the founders said the only way to have a country that is pleasing to God is to acknowledge those foundational principles. And look at this. As they comb back through human history, they discovered that the one political system that fits hand in glove with Christianity is what they called a republic, not a democracy. And so their point was, the only way this country can survive as a republic is if it continues to acknowledge the one true God. That's it. It's that simple. And when the day comes that the bulk of our citizenry will not accept the God of the Bible, think about this. Here's just one cataclysmic statistic. The statistics show, and this is very generous, that 4 out of 10 Americans go to church on Sunday. It's really less than that. Taking an average of all 50 states. All right, so you're telling me that the God of the Bible, who says, the very basic planks of Christianity is first day of the week, Lord's Day worship and Lord's Supper. And over 60% of Americans won't even do that? Well, the God you read about in the Bible is going to put up with that just so long. Particularly when you add to that all of the heinous things that have been going on, like the shedding of innocent blood in the womb by the millions. All right, so we lose our country, we lose our political system, as so many politicians and educators and others are trying to achieve. What are the alternatives? What would keep this nation going? How are we going to hold it together? Well, you know, obviously the popular thing these days is socialism. You know, they won't come out and say communism, fascism, you know, that's the totalitarianism of people like Hitler and Mussolini and others. But socialism seems to be the big thing in our day. And I'm telling you, the Ivy League schools and far beyond have literally saturated and indoctrinated the young people of our country with that ideology. Now they have. And you'll find these young people, and you pay any attention to the news at all, they're openly, vociferously standing up for it, defending it. Well, let's think about it. And is this even a biblical topic, or is this politics? I'm going to refer to a couple of politicians here and there, but I assure you that this isn't political. And I'm not advocating anything political. I'm just going to tell you what people say and believe and how that compares with the Bible. Karl Marx was a philosopher that wrote a book with Friedrich Engels back in the mid-1800s. And I guarantee you this book is popular in a number of places in our country, along with Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, that many of our politicians have read, digested, and are applying it. Then came the Russian Vladimir Lenin, whenever they overthrew the Tsar and did away with the monarchy in Russia. They began promoting these ideas, and then, of course, before World War II and all the way through World War II, Stalin was over Russia, who, by the way, killed millions of his own countrymen because of his ideology. In China, it was applied by Mao Zedong right up into the 70s. Can you believe that? Hard to believe. And they would say, you know, if you said, what? Doing this? What's so great about you? Oh, we're gonna produce utopia on earth. Humans throughout Bible history make such a ridiculous claim as if that's what we want. We got heaven. That's what we want. That's where we're headed. All right, let's define our terms. What are we talking about? And it is true that words are bounced around in society and people have different nuances, different meanings, but here are the basic classic dictionary definitions of socialism, a way of organizing a society in which major industries are owned and controlled pretty much by the government. What's been the big thing in the last 10 or 15 years that the government is trying to take over? Healthcare. So if you just look at that as, well, you know, that might be good, they'll give us money, take it. Now, wait a minute. You're turning over control to the government. Is that the thing to do? What is the purpose of government? What does the Bible say is the purpose of government? If you don't get those questions answered clearly from Scripture, then you're going to be a sitting duck. Let's go with all of this talk that dominates the airways. Any of various economic and political theories advocating collective or governmental ownership and administration of means of production and distribution of goods, a system of society or group living in which there is no private property, pay attention to that, a system or condition of society in which the means are owned in the state, a stage of society in Marxist theory transition between capitalism and communism. That's where we are now. Distinguished by unequal distribution of goods and pay. So what socialism is seeking to do is to redistribute wealth in our nation. And therefore you go after the rich and you use very noble expressions like they should pay their fair share. Okay, so where's that standard that indicates that that's even to be done? But you see what they're trying to do. Allegedly equalize economic prosperity. Now you might think, well, that's not a bad goal, that's noble. Well, how do you know? You've got to go back to the Bible and see God's thinking on these principles. Typically in a socialistic government, the government owns all the property. There is no private property. They'll even control how many children you have. Do you know any countries that do that? They'll control your education. You want to go mathematics? No. We believe that you're more suited for this particular profession, and that's where you're going to go. This is standard in communistic, socialistic countries. Redistribution of wealth, they will even control where you go and where you live. You know, Americans burn up the highways of our nation and the airplanes and all the tram. We go where we want, when we want, leave the country. We don't even have a thought that the government would ever show up at our door and say, no, you're not going to do that. But there are many, many people that live under just such regimes. Government suppresses individuality. You know, our founders really pressed that free speech, made it one of the amendments of our Constitution. Why? What's the big deal? The Bible teach that? It absolutely does. No unauthorized groups, no political dialogue. Look at socialist countries, most of them following the Marxist, Leninist edition or model of socialism.
No closer to the receiver. That's why you got it.
I didn't know I was cutting out. I just listen to myself, though. I don't. You know. Look at these outright communist countries. You're familiar with all of these. They make no bones about it. That's who we are. Let's take, for example, Cuba. Here are the premier socialist countries that we kind of think about. A lot of South American countries get these little dictators, and they turn the country and the government into socialism. Let's just pull one of these out of here and look at this particular country. It was Fidel Castro back in the 50s that led a revolution, and if you're old enough to remember that, and took over that country. Mostly state-run economy, universal health care for every citizen, such as it is, a government-paid education at all levels, numerous social programs. The very concept of redistributing wealth drives and thoroughly permeates that civilization. And yet, by the way, even over 20 years ago, look how many Cubans had gotten out of there as fast as they could. And where do you think they want to go? And do you think they want this country to duplicate what they left? Look at this article written in the Wall Street Journal. It's as if this city has been preserved in amber. Little appears to have changed since Fidel Castro took over in 1959. Cubans have been forbidden to buy new cars. You know that? So if you go to Havana, you're going to see a lot of 1950s, 57 Chevrolet, and I mean, they look pristine. They fix them up, take care of them. You're not going to see new cars. It's illegal. Look at this statement here. Cuban standard of living has deteriorated thanks to the communist government and the U.S. trade embargo, the disappearance of the Soviet Union's economic aid. Hundreds of thousands of Cubans live in substandard. They line up to receive government rations of chicken, rice, and even sugar. The postal service is slow, expensive, unreliable. Home telephones all but non-existent. Internet access severely restricted, mostly reserved for the government and the tourist hotels. On the street, even a casual conversation can prompt a Cuban's criticism of Fidel and the government. This is Cuba today. The monthly rations are distributed in small neighborhood shops. You know, we get tired of lines at Walmart and such places. That's not what these people are enduring. They will starve to death if they don't go get in government lines and line up 10 or 15 deep to get their daily allocations of beans, eggs, a chicken, coffee, rice, yeah, even toilet paper. Wow, what a great place to live. Margaret Thatcher used to be Prime Minister of England. Look what she said. Not merely about economic efficiency and prosperity, but that above all, quote, it was that socialism itself in all of its incarnations, wherever and however it was applied, was morally corrupting. Socialism is morally corrupting? What are you talking about? That ought to get the attention of a Bible believer. Well, I would like to give you evidence that the Bible teaches that socialism is anti-God, it's anti-Christian, it's anti-Bible, and it's anti-American. Fundamental Bible principles with which you're familiar, hand in glove in socialism in its violation of principles. At least 4, and there are others. Number 1, covetousness and greed. How does socialism promote covetousness and greed? I'm telling you, it's endemic to this political ideology, because by insisting on economically equalizing the population, then you are urging segments of the population to have expectations about that and therefore to covet what the government promises to provide. And all you have to do is go look at the welfare class and those that are heavily dependent upon monthly government allotments, and you will see this is rampant. It's rampant in our civilization. The government is perceived to be the entity that can and should make it possible for those who do not have what others have to acquire them. So they see the government as an appropriate middleman. And the fact that it's a middleman, that it's a kind of an entity with no face on it, doesn't change the fact that it is operating in a way that promotes those circumstances. Well, we know what the Bible teaches about this. And whenever God established Israel as a civil government, think about that. The only civil government that God ever established on earth, the only civil law code written by God. Isn't that interesting? The founders referred to the law of Moses a great deal, not because they believed that it was applicable today in the sense of legally. They understood it was the Hebrew law code. But they understood that it was written in order to govern a civil entity, a nation. Well, if you want to create a country then, where would be the best place to go to find out how to do that, how to regulate it? You'd want laws from the mind of God. Now take, for example, capital punishment. What's the general drift and trend of our whole civilization since the 60s? Oh, capital punishment is bad. It's unchristian. And yet the God of the universe wrote no fewer than 17 capital crimes into the law of Moses, for which the death penalty was demanded, including such things as rape. What about adultery? You imagine Congress tomorrow announcing to the whole country, all right, we're going to start executing all adulterers in our country. It would wipe out half the population. That's not funny, that's bizarre. How pleased is God with this? What's the punishment for murder in God's sight? Execution. Where do we put them? On death row and leave them there for years. That's sinful to do that. It violates the mind of God. And he even says further things along that line of how when you do that, here's what's going to happen to your country. Notice how if we update the terminology, don't covet your neighbor's car, clothes, bank account, job, education, food, electronic gadgets, or any other physical possession or accomplishment. George Bernard Shaw was an avowed socialist, and he said, you know, a government that robs Peter to pay Paul, he can always count on the agreement of Paul. He'll be good with that. Well, is that happening in our country now? Look what Ronald Reagan said. The American dream is not that every man must be level with every other. The American dream is that every man must be free to pursue noble goals and to become whatever he should become in God's sight. See how they fit together? That's the Bible. He even inserts God into his description of how civilization ought to function. Number two, it plants the thought in the minds of the have-nots that they ought to have all of the things that the haves have. You think there are any citizens that you and I know that have that attitude? And is it a biblical, scriptural attitude? No, the Bible's very specific about this. Think of the fact that the have-nots observe on a daily basis other people that have all these possessions. Oh man, he's got a brand new iPhone. Well, I deserve an iPhone too. Let's get the government to give us one. That creates and engenders envy and jealousy. And you see, unless all people are taught Christianity and how they ought to perceive their fellow man who has more than they have, if they're not going to church and learning these basic moral principles that ought to permeate our city, well, what do you think is going to happen to that country? Exactly what's happening to ours. Look at James chapter 3. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, Do not boast and lie against the truth. This wisdom does not descend from above. It's earthly, sensual, demonic. For where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil. Well, there's a description of America right now in our country. No wonder Solomon said, again, I saw that for all the toil and every skillful work that a man does, he's envied by his neighbor. Is that not a pithy little insight into humanity? You see, if our leaders were spiritually minded men and women, they would understand these principles. They not only would not make laws that encourage all of that stuff, they would do just the opposite. You know, take, for example, the blue laws. The founders of our civilization said, you know, our country ought to stay Christian. But we're not writing it into our laws in the sense that we're going to mandate everybody be a Christian. I said, we've seen what happens to governments that do that. They came from one. No, but neither are we going to encourage people to neglect biblical concepts. And so they had the blue laws, which said, we're not going to come to your house, we're not going to pull you out of bed at Sunday morning, get down there to the church. No, we're not going to do that. That's not freedom. By the way, God wouldn't do that. He leaves people free to make the choice where they want to spend eternity. They said, but we're not going to have businesses open and have everything going on in our country as business as usual, except emergency services. Think of the successful organizations that tapped into that fundamental early American concept. You know, like Chick-fil-A. You know, they signs all over the country on the freeway. Chick-fil-A coming up, and then in big words, closed on Sunday, like they're proud of it. And how much money do you suppose they're losing? I mean, every time they're open, Monday through Saturday, there's lines all around the building, right? All over the country. I'm waiting for the next generation or two coming down from Truett Cathy to look at the books and say, man, you know how much money we're losing every year? We need to open on Sunday. And I'm not saying it would be sinful for them to do so. That was Old Testament, the Bible. The New Testament doesn't teach that. But the point is, people like Truett Cathy believe there's a God. And if we want him to bless this country, by the way, has he? Is there any doubt that the providence of God has been with this country, by the way, above and beyond all other countries in human history, including Israel, who said, we don't want God. We want a human king. And our founder said just the opposite. Patrick Henry referred to the majesty of heaven. They said, we don't want a human king. God is our king. You show me another country like that in all of human history. I believe he looked down on this incredible experiment and said, I'm going to bless that country. And if you don't think he has, you need to look at every category where America has pretty much exceeded the rest of the world. Including, for example, if you go to foreign countries, their toilets are not as good as ours. Not to mention things like here we are sitting here with light bulbs. We shared that with the world. There's lighting all over the country. The world was in darkness before America invented that, not by the government, but by an industrious individual, and then spread it to the world. And we could spend days itemizing all the things that Americans have done, like the vacuum cleaner. Ladies, aren't you glad that you have something to originate in America? Americans smarter than everybody else? Nah. Asians score higher on IQ tests. No, the only explanation, and the founder said this, it's God. He's blessed us. Number 3, government promoting socialistic ideology is in fact promoting stealing. In which, you know, if one citizen goes and takes from another citizen without the consent of that citizen, that's stealing. Everybody sees that. But what if you put the government right in the middle? Let the government take it from a citizen and give it to who the government wants to give it to without the consent of the individual from whom they took it, extorted it. Should we pay taxes? The Bible teaches that. For what purpose? The founders were clear about that. To fulfill the purpose of government, which is not to extort money from citizens in order to give to other citizens. I'm telling you, they were so clear on that. And the Bible is clear on it. Go to the passages that tell you what the government what the purpose of the government is, ordained by God. 1 Peter 2, many other passages. This enables the government to steal from some citizens, give to others without their consent. How many of you have a cell phone? You ever looked on your cell phone bill? You're paying a fee that's used to give people free cell phones. Did you know that? All of you are. That's how slick the government is now. They're able to rob us without us even knowing it's happening. Now, does God say if you want to give a cell phone to somebody, out of the kindness and benevolence of your heart, should you do that? Yeah. But that's not the role of the government. By taking money from people, did you know we have a diaper program? You're paying for that too. And on and on. You would not believe what all your tax dollars are going for. Number 4, socialism strikes at the very heart of the concept of freedom. And we don't have time to expound on that, but you know good and well that when God created man in his own image, Genesis 1:26, that included the idea that we are free moral agents. He wants all of us to be completely free to decide our eternal destiny. Government's not to interfere with that, except where we violate laws that God himself wants enforced, of course. But that's not what they're doing. In fact, they don't do much of that anymore, do they? I was up in Vermont within the last year, and the preacher drove me by a motel. I forgot which one it was, motel chain. And there were 2 or 3 police cars in the parking lots around it. It looked run down. It's over. I said, "What's going on there?" And he said, Vermont brought in a whole bunch of illegal immigrants and put them in this hotel. And he said, crime is rampant. It's spreading out into the community. There's all sorts of horrible things happening, and the police are there to try to keep order. People are calling evil good and good evil. Our civilization, at least a lot of our leaders, and a good sizable portion of our citizenry, have lost their mind, their spiritual mind. They're unfamiliar with the God of the Bible. Look what Karl Marx said on this idea of private property. In this sense, the theory of the communists may be summed up in a single sentence. You ought to sit up and pay attention to that. Abolition of private property. So, what's wrong with that? Because the Bible teaches that we human beings have the freedom to acquire property. Remember whenever Abraham purchased real estate from the sons of Heth? That was all right for him to do. And it was his land when he did so. Cave of Machpelah. And do you remember, by the way, here's just a side note, and I hope you understand what I'm doing here. This doesn't have anything whatsoever to do with, skin color or anything like that. The Bible teaches very clearly on that. But you remember this movie that made a lot of noise not too long ago. I went to the internet and heard an interview from a radio station. Here is what Patrice Culler said. The fellow was saying, you guys have this movement going. What is your ideological underpinnings? What's the foundation? What are you after here? Great question. And she said, well, we actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. Have you heard that expression? See, that's a socialistic, communist expression, which are people connection. We are trained Marxists. No bones about it. We established this movement to promote Marxism, not concern over a particular ethnic group of people. That's what she's saying. That's a cover, you see, which is exactly how Marxists and communists have operated everywhere in the world for many years. And we're not studying history to see it. Well, do you remember in Acts chapter 4, Ananias and Sapphira sold that piece of property, brought most of the money apparently, kept back some, but gave the impression that they were giving all of it. And you remember what Peter said to them? while it remained, was it not yours? That was your piece of property, right? That was yours. It was your decision as to whether to keep it or sell it. See, private property. And even after you sold it and got the proceeds, that was yours too, and you didn't have to give that up either. There's a tacit endorsement of the biblical concept of private property. The Bible nails this down over and over throughout Scripture. You can't harmonize that with socialism. I love the example of Jesus telling the story of the 11th hour workers. Remember, these guys get there early and they work hard, bear the heat of the day. And then these other fellows show up about an hour before closing time or stopping time. And the owner says, I'm going to pay you guys the same thing I'm paying everybody else. And some of those came and objected, well, that's not fair. And look what God is the one represented here. Friend, I'm not doing you any wrong. What was our agreement? Our agreement was you come and start working, and at the end of the day, I'll give you a denarius. We had an arrangement, right? You agreed to it. Take what is, look at this, private property. The money of the landowner was transferred to the workers. All right, it's yours. Take it and go. It's yours. You own it. I wish to give to this last man the same as to you. Is that not lawful for me to do what I wish with my own things? There is a biblical concept. And the founder said, the government has no right to take anything from you except by your consent through your elected representatives. Well, obviously, we're not controlling our representatives, are we? So we are culpable. We are responsible. God imparts free will to every person at birth, without regard or with regard to their possessions, and therefore you have the right to exercise that free will in view of eternity. But doesn't capitalism teach greed and envy? Have you heard that before? Over and over and over. No, it's not endemic to the system. Why? Well, because you're under obligation by God to work and make provision for yourself and your family. That's a biblical principle. And therefore, if you do that, then you're not being greedy or covetousness by simply doing that. Capitalism is nothing more than an ambitious person rising above laziness and applying himself through legal means to support himself. Take, for example, if you decide to work for 10 years by taking 2 jobs and set the money aside, and after 10 years you go buy your own business, laundromat, and you spend time fix it all up and it starts being profitable and so forth. Is that inherently a greedy activity? No. Now, you may take all that money and say, well, I'm not going to give this to anybody. I'm not going to give to the church on the first day of the week, blah, blah, blah. Well, that would be. But you see, it's not endemic to the concept, to the system of capitalism. But it is with socialism. Alexis de Tocqueville was a French historian who came to America in the early 1830s. And wow, what a powerful 2-volume work that he went back to France and published it, Democracy in America. And we may not want to hear anything a Frenchman has to say, but this guy had some great insights. Democracy and socialism have nothing in common but one word, equality. But notice the difference. Democracy seeks equality and freedom. Socialism seeks equality and restraint and servitude. Sir Winston Churchill, who was prominent, of course, during World War II, as one of our prominent allies, very much needed. The inherent vice of capitalism is the unequal sharing of blessings. The inherent virtue of socialism is the equal sharing of misery. Socialism is the philosophy of failure, the creed of ignorance, and the gospel of envy. I'm confident none of our public schools are teaching any of this. They're not teaching history, true history, and showing how these forces in world history have operated, interacted with each other. Did the early church practice Christian socialism? How many of you have actually heard people say that? Well, we ought to be doing that because the early church did it. Now, wait a minute. Let's go back and study our Bibles. Both in Acts 2 and Acts 4, we have this statement about those Christians having all things in common. Acts 4:32, they had all things in common. Well, what does that mean? What is this talking about? What's going on in this context? Well, it's a reference to Christian socialism or some sort of a common stock to which everyone is under obligation to input, and then it's doled out in order for everybody to get equality in the distribution. This is a very unique situation. Remember, you've got thousands and thousands. Josephus says concerning another dual festival of Pentecost, Passover and Pentecost, there were over 1 million Jews from countries all over the world. Here they converge, 3 times a year on Jerusalem. You got all these people here, and lo and behold, in AD 30, here's the gospel presented in its complete format for the first time on the planet. They didn't anticipate that. And about 3,000 converted the first day, and then you continue reading those chapters, and thousands more added. Minority of Jews, but nevertheless a lot of people who no doubt brought provisions with them for these dual festivals in order to be able to survive and then go back home when they got close to running out of their means. Well, here they are staying. They never anticipated this, basking in the marvelous light of the gospel and interacting with all of these fellow Christians. And so these pilgrims were running out of the means of supporting themselves. And consequently, there were members there in the vicinity of Jerusalem who sold property, gathered their funds, and gave it to the apostles so that the apostles could help those who were in need before back home. All of this strictly voluntary, not commanded, and no indication this is a principle that's supposed to be enacted in churches of Christ for all time. And it certainly didn't involve a civil government. No other church in the New Testament is depicted as copying this arrangement, and no subsequent command is given to do so. Very unique situation. No such thing as Christian socialism. That's a contradiction in terms. I don't know if you remember, some years ago, one of our presidents started using buzzwords, terminology that, again, I'm sure just went right over the heads of most Americans. But it's very specific socialist, communist terminology. Redistributive change, redistributive justice, income inequality. What was he talking about? He's saying that when you look at a civilization and you got people that have 5 cars and people don't have any cars, that's unequal. And so we need to kind of level that. The 5-car owner needs to pay his fair share. See, built into even making such a statement implies that that's somehow unfair. For one person to have one thing or 2 things or 3 things and another person not have that at all. Well, that's unfair. See, that's a flawed concept to begin with. It includes taxation designed to move wealth from one group to another, land reform, other means to promote equality of result. It's associated with Marxism and socialism. Redistributive justice is exercised by government through taxation. See, the way the dictators of history have done it is they stage a coup, a military, bloody coup, and take over a government. That's what these South American countries are doing, and many others have done it. Hitler did it, ultimately. Mussolini. Well, that's not what's happening in our country. Americans, I think, we're ready to get our guns and put a stop to that, which, by the way, ought to enter into our understanding of why there would be all of these political efforts to reduce and eliminate guns and ammunition. It's all part of this. That's what every socialist government does. You disarm the people. I'm telling you. Just go read it. Well, consequently, the government taxes people to accomplish the same objective. This is a form of coercion that is ungodly. Number one, you cannot legislate the poverty by legislating the wealthy out of prosperity. What one person receives without working for, another person must work for without receiving. The government cannot give to anybody anything the government does not first take from somebody else. By dividing it, when half of the people get the idea that they do not have to work because the other half is going to take care of them, and when the other half gets the idea that it does no good to work because somebody else is going to get what they work for, that has historically been the beginning of an end for a nation. One of the many forces operating in our country. Go read some of the materials by, for example, this distinguished professor of economics at George Mason University, Walter Williams. Great stuff. This is why socialism employs evil means, confiscation, intimidation to accomplish what are often seen as noble goals. You're helping your fellow man. See how they flag. Isn't that how Satan operates? He always has. He floats it under a surface good thing. And if you don't study and see what God's view is, then you'll fall for it. Helping one's fellow man. Helping one's fellow man is in need by reaching into one's own pockets to do so. That's laudable and praiseworthy. Helping one's fellow man through coercion and reaching into another's pockets is evil and worthy of condemnation. Tragically, most teachings, look at this, from the church on down, support government use of one person to serve the purposes of another. The advocates cringe from calling it such and prefer to call it charity or duty. This fellow, former senior fellow at the Cato Institute, nobody in America is poor because when you listen to the media, you'd get that idea. The only way the rich can be rich is because people are poor. That's a lie. They're not connected. The academic literature is very solid. Look at this. You want to end poverty in America? You know, Jesus said the poor you'll have with you always. Why? Because a lot of people aren't willing to do what you need to do to get out of poverty. And number one, graduate from school. Get an education. Prepare yourself to have a trade. To have a job. Number two, if you're not married, don't have a baby. Number three, get a job and stick with it. That's simple, and I'm telling you the literature is uniform on this all over our country. But socialists hate it to promote it. So, they are not interested in studying Christianity and what the Bible teaches on these principles. I went through the book of Proverbs with this question. You know, it talks a lot about poverty. This is all in a deeper study of this that we don't have time to look at. But just go through the Proverbs. What does the Proverbs say? Here's God's mind about the causes of poverty. It's incredible. Laziness, I put a lot of these together because they're very similar. Being idle, sleeping too much. Number two, slackness, not being diligent and attentive. It needs to be done, men and women. Your lawn needs mowing. I got to get that done. I'll do that tomorrow. I'll do it Saturday. You know, the more you put that off. Now apply that principle to life. We must not be slack and lazy. Lack of wisdom, failure to be frugal, foolish use of resources. I had a fellow come to me and say, my mother's in the hospital. Could you possibly give me some money to help her? Okay, see, if I say no, I'm the bad guy. But I said, well, wait a minute. I know for a fact that you're getting a monthly stipend from the government that's a pretty good amount. What happened to that? I use that to buy my grandkids Christmas presents. I said, well, shouldn't you have used that to help your mother in the hospital? I had to give Christmas presents to my grandchildren. Okay, there's your problem. You're foolish. You lack discretion and wisdom. And by the way, you're living your life based on your emotions. And I know grandchildren create that. But you got to keep it about you and think. Frivolity, love of pleasure, physical stimulation. How much of our civilization is eaten up with that? It leads to poverty. Dishonesty and theft, covetousness, desire for someone else to supply. This is all in the Proverbs. How about fear? They're just afraid to go for it. You go to school? Great. I don't think I could do that. Stingy, non-generous, isn't that an interesting cause? How many poor people give to other people? Oh no, they're in a mindset. I'm the receiver. Everybody else is to be the giver. And if I run into a fellow receiver, well then both of us are trying to do the same thing. They wouldn't give to each other. No Christianity there. Refusal to be corrected. All 9 of these don't have anything to do with some deep economic theory that we just need to tweak and fix in our country. They have to do with personal choices that human beings make. The Bible teaches anything, it teaches that we humans are going to stand before God individually for our choices. Anybody American can get ahead if they'll work and go after it. Do you know that? I have no fear of successful contradiction. Anyone in America can get ahead if they're willing to put in the hard work, time, effort, and energy. And the cases and instances of that from people you would never think could get anywhere are legion throughout our civilization. All right, look at these biblical solutions. Finish their education, get married before having children, get a job. All right, I'm going to close with this, and I realize this is not a biblical thing, but it definitely highlights biblical concepts from a religious perspective. You're familiar with these people. William Bradford was part of the Pilgrims that signed the compact on the they deboarded. Do you remember when they arrived on the coast of the country? He was the colony's governor for 30 years, wrote a journal titled Plymouth Plantation. You can download free online and read it. Here's a very famous painting that is in Washington. They are on the deck of the ship Speedwell after they have left Delft, Holland. You remember they fled from England because of religious persecution, then went to Holland, and then from there headed to America. This is a symbol, by the way, of God's presence, this rainbow. And notice this is the book of Socialism. I think that's Karl Marx's manifesto there, you think? It's the Bible. William Bradford kneeling behind the first governor, John Carver. Here they are aboard the ship signing the Mayflower Compact. You know what that thing said? Here it is in his own words. All profits and benefits that are got by trade, traffic, trucking, working, fishing, or any other means of any person or persons remain still in the common stock until the division. We're going to form a common stock. Everybody who gets anything puts it into that, then we will dole it out equally to everybody. Socialism. All such persons as are of this colony are to have their meat, drink, apparel, and all provisions out of the common stock of goods and of said colony. There it is. I mean, you can't get any plainer than that, can you? That is an exact model of socialism. Entitlement, redistribution approach, which led to failure. And I mean, he goes into great detail. I wish we had time. They began to think how they might raise as much corn as they could and obtain a better crop than they had done. So that they might not still languish in misery. So my point to you is, I won't take you through all the detail, but it failed. They were starving. It didn't work. So they sat down and said, let's rethink this. At length, after much debate, the governor, with the advice of the chiefest among them, gave way that they should set corn every man for his own particular, and in that regard trust to themselves. Everybody be independent and individually responsible for themselves. And in all others to go on in general way as before. And so assign to every family a parcel of land according to the proportion of their number of that end, only for present use. Ranged all boys and youth under some family. If there were any young people that didn't have parents, then they were put in a family. This had very good success. It made all hands very industrious, so as much more corn were planted than otherwise would have been by any means, and the governor or any other could use, and saved him a great deal of trouble, gave far better content. The women now went willingly into the field and took their little ones with them to set corn, which before they would allege weakness, inability. Oh, I don't feel good today, I can't go out of work. Whom to have compelled would have been thought great tyranny and oppression. Well, it would have been. That's the government. Tyranny and oppression. The experience that it was had in this common course and condition, tried sundry years, and that amongst godly and sober men may well evince the vanity of that conceit of Plato's and other ancients, applauded by some of later times, that the taking away of property and bringing in community into a commonwealth would make them happy and flourishing, as if they were wiser than God. How about that? For this community, so far as it was found to breed much confusion and discontent, retard much employment that would have been to their benefit and comfort. The young men that were most able and fit for labor and service did repine that they should spend their time and strength to work for other men's wives and children without any recompense. The strong or man of parts had no more in division of victuals and clothes than he that was weak and not able to do a quarter of the other that the other could. This was thought injustice. The aged and graver men to be ranked and equalized in labors and victuals, food, clothes, with the meaner or common and younger sort, thought it some indignity and disrespect unto them. And for men's wives to be commanded to do service for other men, as dressing their meat, washing their clothes, they deemed it a kind of slavery. Neither could many husbands well brook it. Upon the point all being to have alike and all to do alike, they thought themselves in the like condition, and no one as good as another. And so, if it did not cut of those relations with God, that God hath set amongst men, yet it did at least much diminish and take of the mutual respects that should be preserved among them, and would have been worse if they had been men of another condition. He's saying these are moral people that believe in Christian principles. And that approach didn't work. So the problem is not in the economic approach. That's a flawed system. The problem is you don't understand who human beings are and how God created them to function. Once they got that straight, things straightened up. Clearly in harmony of God's will, God wants men to share with each other, and they did that. He made the point that those who had plenty could turn around and help those who needed help, and even sell to others who needed to have some purchase, but there's no coercion there, just like we saw in Acts chapter 5. That money and that land was your own. You had the right to do what you wanted with it. By this time, harvest was come instead of famine. Now God gave them plenty. The face of things was changed to the rejoicing of many hearts, for which they blessed God. All right, to summarize, at least, and there are others, 4 fundamental principles that show socialism is unbiblical, it's contrary to the thinking of God, and it is damaging and harmful to any country. It promotes covetousness, foments envy and jealousy, incorporates stealing, and nullifies free will, private property. Some years ago, I put out this book on the government, and where'd that $5 price go there, man? I guess he thought that's not a good thing. That's socialistic. But anyways, at half price, we'll set some out if you're interested. And there's a lot more here that we need to know. Like this unalienable rights. What's that about? Where's that in the Bible? And what about this big national discussion about illegal immigration? Bible have anything to say to that? Go to Acts 17, where we're told God himself has drawn the borders of nations. Don't tell me borders are unbiblical. Who drew the tribal boundaries of the tribes of Canaan? Not men. God did. He's all for borders for nations. That can't be wrong. And therefore enforcement of borders. Well, there's so much stuff like that. What about Native Americans? Weren't those who came to our shores in the 1600s doing the same thing that illegals are doing to us today? Didn't they come and take other people's land? No, they did not. You need to go study it. All that material available to you through AP. Well, I hope that's encouraging and uplifting and helpful to you because if Christianity does anything, it applies to everyday life and what's going on all over this planet. And I would suggest to you that we in Churches of Christ have long understood that in our presentation of the gospel and God's will, we have had to recognize the signs of the time and respond to those things that are detrimental to God's work on earth. I believe the number one reason why God has blessed this country is to provide a haven for the one true Church of Christ to flourish numerically more than anywhere else in 2,000 years, and to send missions around the globe. That's what's been happening here in this country. And if our nation goes down, and God may well bring that about, it'll obviously be that we will no longer ultimately serve those critical purposes. That would be a tragedy. So the preaching of the gospel, the advancing of the principles of Scripture are absolutely critical in our own nation's history for such a time as this. How do we know that that's not? We ought to view the Lord's church this way. As we see society disintegrating around us, the ultimate solution is preach the gospel. I recognize that. But we need to recognize just what's happening so that we can take the gospel and get people's thinking straight in hopes of perpetuating our nation so that it can continue to serve the purposes for which God wants it to serve. There may be someone here in our assembly this evening that has never obeyed the gospel. It's tragic that Christendom is one divided mess. That's not the church of the Bible. Oh, there were doctrinal issues, I guess, in all the congregations at the beginning, but they all shared in the concept that there's one church. It's the church that Jesus said, I will build, and he did build. It's organized in a very particular way. The only way you can get into it is through a very particular process. Steps. That was right, steps that our brother just told us. And then you can become a New Testament Christian by contacting the blood of Christ. Man, we've got to press that with people. There may be someone here that needs that studied with, or you might be ready to make that decision now. Isn't that the most important decision you'll ever make? And then as Christians, we've got to live faithful. And I suggest to you that we're living in such a materialistic society that it is so easy for us to be distracted, diverted, and preoccupied with things that if Jesus comes tonight will mean nothing. We as the church need to divert more of our time, more of our resources, and more of our efforts to promote the cause of Christ before it is too late. If you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, we encourage you to do that as we stand and sing.